You're about to hear a story buried in plain sight. A history hidden not in a locked vault, but on the very ground we walk on, in towns we drive past without a second thought. I'm Rondia Kaufer, and this is From Chains to Change. In our last chapter, we witnessed a miracle of resilience. We saw how Eatonville, Florida, emerged from the dust and cypress swamps of the post-Reconstruction South. It was built from determination, from deeds purchased with pennies saved from backbreaking labor. It was one of the very first self-governed Black towns in America, a beacon of hope, a declaration of self-worth carved into the Florida soil. But this survival, this fragile independence, was never guaranteed. Now, we uncover the trials that followed, the relentless forces that conspired to erase Eatonville from the map, to silence its story forever. For the founders of Eatonville, freedom on paper was supposed to be freedom in practice. But the ink on their charter had barely dried when the system began to push back. In the halls of power in Tallahassee, Florida legislators began to tighten the rules, weaving a web of laws designed to suffocate Black autonomy. They carved out legal loopholes, passed statutes that stripped towns like Eatonville of their ability to govern, to tax, to protect themselves. Land surveys would mysteriously shift, redrawing boundaries overnight. Vital records, deeds, tax payments, town charters would vanish from county clerks' offices. Eatonville's very soil was under siege, not by an invading army, but by the silent, devastating weapons of ink and statute. This bureaucratic war had devastating personal consequences. Imagine the story of one family who had farmed their plot on the edge of town for a generation. They had poured their sweat, their hopes, their future into that land. Then one morning, a white neighbor arrived with a new deed, claiming their original title was invalid. The case went to a court that was never meant for them, before a judge who saw them not as landowners, but as problems. The ruling was swift. Generations of work, of belonging, were erased with a single stroke of the judge's pen. Their farm was gone. This was not an isolated theft. It was a calculated strategy, a cruel blueprint repeated across the South to dispossess Black families and dismantle their communities, piece by painful piece. And when intimidation in the courtrooms and clerks' offices wasn't enough, the threat took on a more visceral, terrifying form. It came by torchlight. Then came the riders. Hooded men with torches, the physical embodiment of the hatred that simmered just beyond the town's borders. The Ku Klux Klan, emboldened by their reign of terror across the state, marched just miles from Eatonville. The smoke from the Ocoee Massacre of 1920, where a Black community was burned to the ground for daring to vote, was a chilling reminder of what could happen. The glow of their fires could be seen on the horizon, a promise of violence. But Eatonville would not be broken. Town leaders gathered in secret, meeting by the soft glow of lamplight in church basements and back rooms. They weren't planning an escape. They were planning a defense. Every prayer whispered in the dark, every man who stood watch at the edge of town through the long night, was an act of resistance. They were determined not to abandon what their parents had built, what they had bled for. This was their home, and they would not let the darkness claim it. Against every effort to erase them, from the legislator's pen to the Klansman's torch, Eatonville stood. Its survival was anchored in faith, but this was a faith with its sleeves rolled up, a faith that built its own sanctuary against the storm. In the dark, families prayed in whispers, finding solace and strength in the quiet hum of community. The hymns that echoed from the wooden walls of St. Lawrence African Methodist Episcopal Church weren't just songs of praise, they were anthems of endurance, a collective voice rising against the silence meant to swallow them. Every hymn sung, every plank nailed to that church was an act of defiance. It was a public declaration of permanence in a world that saw them as temporary. And while the adults fortified the present, they invested everything in the future. By day, they sent their children to school as if the world were not closing in, creating a bubble of dignity and aspiration. At the Robert Hungerford Normal and Industrial School, education was more than reading and arithmetic. It was a tool of liberation. Here, children were taught not just how to survive in a hostile world, but how to build their own, learning skills for self-sufficiency, and a curriculum that affirmed their history and their worth. This commitment to self-determination was most visible in the town hall. Against the odds, Eatonville ruled itself. While the rest of Florida was tightening the grip of Jim Crow, Eatonville was a place where black men debated ordinances, managed public funds, and kept the peace. To govern themselves was not just leadership, it was resistance in its most fundamental form. It was a living, breathing refutation of the racist ideologies that underpinned segregation. Zora Neale Hurston's own father, John Hurston, served 3 terms as mayor. He wasn't just a politician. He was a symbol of what was possible when a community was free to choose its own leaders, a testament to the town's capacity for self-governance. And from this defiant soil grew its most powerful voice, Zora Neale Hurston herself. She didn't just write about Eatonville. She channeled its spirit, its wit, its unshakable dignity. Her novels and folklore collections became the town's living archive, preserving the porch talk, the sermons, and the stories that the outside world ignored. Through her, the voice of Eatonville reached far beyond the Florida pines, becoming an indelible part of the American story. Eatonville was not supposed to survive, yet it did. That survival, quiet and steadfast, is its greatest defiance, a testament not to a single rebellion, but to 1,000 daily acts of resistance, a prayer, a lesson, a vote, and a story told for the world to hear. In Part 1, we witnessed the birth of Eatonville, a promise forged from the determination of formerly enslaved people. We saw a community built on the radical dream of self-governance, one of America's first incorporated all-black towns. But this survival was never guaranteed. Freedom always carried a target. In Part 2, we uncover the relentless trials that conspired to erase Eatonville from the map and from memory. This is the story of their fight to hold on. The freedom they secured on paper soon met chains of law in practice. Across Florida, legislators tightened rules, crafting a web of bureaucratic obstacles to suffocate black autonomy. Incorporation laws were amended. Tax codes placed impossible burdens on landowners. Land surveys mysteriously shifted, their borders redrawn by an unseen hand. Eatonville's soil was under siege, not by guns, but by a silent war waged with ink and statute. For many, this assault felt abstract, until it arrived at their door. One family watched as their farmland, a legacy for their children, vanished overnight. A neighbor, armed with a questionable claim, declared their deed invalid. In a biased courtroom, the judge's gavel fell. Generations of hope were erased with a stroke of a pen. This was not an isolated incident. It was a calculated strategy, a blueprint for dispossession repeated across the South. When legal intimidation failed to break their spirit, terror came by torchlight. The Ku Klux Klan marched within striking distance of Eatonville, their fiery crosses a violent warning in the night. The threat was no longer about losing land, it was about losing lives. Yet the people did not flee. Town leaders gathered in secret, determined not to abandon the sanctuary they had built. Every prayer, every night watch was an act of profound resistance. Eatonville's struggle was not fought in isolation. As they held their ground, another beacon of black self-determination was rising in Mississippi, Mound Bayou. Some call Eatonville the first incorporated black town, others point to Mound Bayou. Both are true, and both matter. Eatonville was among the first incorporated. Mound Bayou was a thriving black city carved from wilderness. They were sister cities in a shared struggle, proving that wherever freedom was denied, Black America would build it themselves. Against every effort to dismantle them, Eatonville stood, its very survival an act of rebellion. The bells of its churches didn't just call people to worship, they rang out as a declaration of resilience. Its schools didn't just teach reading, they opened doors to a future the world tried to close, and its storytellers, like Zora Neale Hurston, carried the town's voice and spirit far beyond Florida, embedding it in America's cultural bedrock. Yet even in survival, a different threat crept in, the slow silence of history. As decades passed, Eatonville's revolutionary story began to fade. School textbooks skipped its name. New highways were routed around it, turning a central community into a place you simply passed by. Tourists drove on, unaware the soil beneath them held such history. Eatonville was becoming a ghost in America's collective memory. This erasure was its own form of violence, but Eatonville's story does not end here. Its legacy forces us to ask a larger, more painful question. What happens when this pressure escalates into outright massacre? In my next video, we will travel to places like Ocoee, Florida, where communities were burned to the ground, their stories deliberately buried. This is not just history. This is memory, fighting to be heard. If no one else remembers, then we must. Please subscribe and hit that like button. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next video.